Hello, let me heard.
Yeah, I can hear you.
Oh, cool. Awesome. Yeah. I was sorry, my laptop. It's like yes. There. Hey. Cool. Let me just prepare my timer. You hear Augie and the cockroaches? That's not my timer. Okay. See? Sorry. I'll start. I'll take my POIs through voice. My name's Hesaya. I'll start in three, two, one. Ladies and
I'll
gentlemen,
start.
I'm
I'll
a
take.
Filipino, and I think it's absolutely stupid if we suddenly start focusing in developing a Philippine iPhone, a Philippine electrical vehicle, or any sort of superconductor or technology. Yeah, there may be upsides in developing these manufacturing stuff, but it's so outcome dependent. And number one, our success in doing so, and number two, us actually succeeding in the economies in scale to compete against these big fucking countries, America, EU, China, or every other first world country that wants to get this piece of the pie. How can you get a match with them when they've almost perfected it? Get that supply chain fully finished, furnished, and complete. We don't have the skills, we don't have the money, and we don't have the resources, supply chain, and capacities to do it. That's why we think in our world it is best to focus and prioritize in growing our service based industries. Before that, I'm gonna have some characterizations. Firstly, this is a value judgment debate. So what we should be prioritizing is what is the priority for these countries to develop. Developing countries or emerging markets. This looks like Asia, parts of Africa, Latin America, or any more that's emerging out there. In a perfect world, yeah, we can do both. We're going to do service industry, and we're also going to do our traditional and manufacturing industry. But the world is simply not perfect. We're all at what because of those limited and scarce resources. And what ends up happening is we're going to chase two rabbits and catch none of them. So it is far better to grow service-based industries over traditional industries because these are our current strengths, ladies and gentlemen. And me, as a Filipino, I know that for the reason that it is our biggest export here in our country. Human capital. It is the lifeblood of the service industry. Nurses, hospitalities, teachers, call centers, agents, and all of those are what we have as a competitive advantage and economies of scale for us. Because developed economies don't dabble in this because they can already outsource talent from these developing nations, which is something that we can give them, making it currently status quo a win-win. I scratch your back, you scratch my back. So why fix a system that's not really broken? Why is it so hard also for us to actually do? Well, economic cost of more money in manufacturing, building factories and distribution centers to create semiconductor, all these stuff is super hard to do. And even if we try to do this, this creates a large sense of inefficiency and redundancy, guys. It's almost impossible for us to have a chance. And we think it's also unlikely. And this is also the sole reason that we want to focus on our service industry. So why is it unlikely, just in case, just some preemptive stuff, why is it unlikely for the richer countries to just out of nowhere drop us and throw us away? Because first things first, we're already in a sort of symbiotic system where we help each other get money from remittances from them, and then they get services and talent from us. But secondly, we think
Or
this is our only leverage because we if we lose all that leverage, well, we this is our leverage, and we don't grow. If we don't grow what we do, we lose that leverage and we become a threat to them if we start trying to focus on something that they're already good at. What might end up happening is even if we somehow get a chance on building that industry, it's likely that they're going to either find a way to take that down or buy it on to themselves and add it to their pile of things that they can do, which doesn't really help our country do that ideal idea of, oh, we're gonna keep developing because those skills will all be taken by them. And those things and leverages will be all taken from them. So I'll take your POI before I get to my other stuff.
The biggest comparative advantage developing economies have is their low cost of labor. If you're worried about the competition from the West in other things, don't you think you should focus on the thing you have the most comparative advantage on, i.e., the agrarian industry?
Wait, sorry. We say that low cost labor happens in a world where we actually don't develop our own service industries. When our service people are not actually educated well enough, not actually highly talented in what they're good at, not actually giving all that skills to its maximum capacity. And that only happens in a world where we get high level jobs, high jobs with skill that are worth to be paid for when we actually start developing our service industry. So what does prioritizing growth exactly look like? Well, we think that it means spending more and putting a larger part of our GDP towards something that's already that we're doing well at. These developing countries have hundreds of thousands of overseas workers that we give from abroad. So lots of people there. We want to further help those people, further incentivize those people to keep earning money because that's where their high paying jobs are. They are paid as doctors, they are paid as teachers, they are paid as all those highly cost stuff. And this looks like more government initiatives to support them, giving them tax breaks, incentives because of the remittance that they give. We also say that this looks like we want them to be incentivized to keep working hard and send money back home, and also even paths to education, and maybe investing in schools that are likely to create these people with high skills that are wanted by those other countries. So this puts in more money in the service industry, and it also helps the country from the inside as we try to build more hospitals, health, hospitality stuff, BPOs, and call centers, and we get a bigger capacity for that. And this allows more people to be incentivized and creates more jobs for them. And not only that, we think that the current market we have is still limited to America and things like that. Maybe, for example, the Philippines. But since they all have these possibilities and all have, since they all have their it's likely that they all have values. Maybe for the Philippines, for example, sorry, it's likely for them to have the English advantage, able to speak well. They can leverage those capacities, and other countries could also be incentivized as they continue to push for this idea to start going and buying in to hire more of these export workers from these countries. And what ends up happening is we get more monies, more jobs, as it opens up the world for more people to start coming to this, so more people to know about that country. And it only happens once we start focusing in our service industries. That is why we are so proud to propose this debate. Yes.
Thank you very much for that speech. Welcome, leader of opposition.
Thanks so much. Just checking that I can be heard.
Yes.
Great. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. In this speech, I'm going to do a couple things. Firstly, I'm going to do a couple points of setup and characterize what this debate actually looks like and what these countries are most likely to be. Then I'm going to explain why the service industry, firstly, would be impossible to set up properly, but even if it was set up properly, it would be used poorly and have little benefits. Finally, I'm going to explain why traditional industries are the best things to develop for the people within these nations. Okay, let's start on setup. First question I want to ask is just what are the countries that we're discussing in this debate? Because side government seems to think that this is limited to the Philippines, but most of these countries are actually not primarily service-based in the status quo. The majority of them are primarily agrarian. For example, Bangladesh, for example, India, for example, Pakistan, most African nations are in this position because mechanistically, when you have a lot of people in your country, which notably these are high population countries, and all of these people need to be able to eat. This is probably the thing they go into first, which means you get countries with underdeveloped agrarian industries, sure, but agrarian industries nonetheless. The second thing to note about these countries is that they lack infrastructure. They probably don't have good roads. They probably don't have Wi-Fi across the country. They probably don't even have an excess of office buildings that people could go to complete these kinds of jobs. The next thing I'll note is that these simply just, as I mentioned before, are incredibly high population countries. There are lots of people here, lots of people that the government has to deal with. And this leads to the fourth thing about these countries. They are poor. They are much poorer than developed countries. They generally have a weak currency. They don't have a lot of people they can tax. And the people they do tax, they tax minimally and then have to put that money back into services like welfare, which means they lack money, and the money they do have is often wrapped up in other projects already. Okay, what then do we stand for on side opposition? Notably, the topic says manufacturing and traditional industries, which you should believe on a plain English reading of the motion is stuff like agriculture, it's stuff like mining, it's stuff like manufacturing clothes. It's what a lot of these countries are doing already. In contrast, service industries, like side government discusses, are things like IT, it's things like banking, it's things like call centers or AI centers. Okay, first point of substantive then. Why the service industry will be done poorly, both in that it is impossible to set up and that it renders little reward when it is. Let's go through a couple of reasons why it would be nearly impossible to actually set up these industries to an extent where they would function properly. The first thing to say is that there's just a lot of missing infrastructure here. Like I flagged and set up, there isn't Wi-Fi that's good quality across the board. Banking services often don't exist. A lot of times they'll be informal banks or people will simply keep their money with them. Computers are not widespread across the country. People might not have access to these things because they are quite poor, because they don't have a job in an industry that allows them to make enough money to afford a computer. And all of these things are necessary for it. But also it's things like university, it's things like education centers, which when they do exist are incredibly expensive. They're often in regions that are mainly cities. This is far away from the majority population, which is rural, and it's hard to access even if you can access it. The second thing to say is that if you want to build these kind of infrastructure, if you want to make more of it, it would take lots of time because you have to start from scratch. And we'll note here, no thank you, that there's also a lot of corruption in the governments in these countries. So what you have to deal with is not only an expensive project, not only a project that would take forever, but also a project hampered by issues with the government itself. The next thing to note is that the population is by and large not skilled for these industries. People who have worked their family farm their entire life will have an incredibly hard time breaking into IT, breaking into hospitality, breaking into nursing. And even if they can do this, it takes being able to go to university, being able to go to a training center, and this takes teachers. And all of these things are in a shortage. All of these things are across the country in specific urban locations. These are things that the majority of people find hard to access. So it would take a lot of time. It would take a lot of money. As we've already established, our government is low on money, and the money it does have, it's already using to provide some welfare to citizens who are currently struggling. No, thank you. Next, then, even if they can build up these industries, they wouldn't be competitive. Why is this true? Firstly, there are lots of existing supply chains for services within developed countries. It's unclear they would ever be as good as an equivalent worker in the developed world. So, if you have someone who does a tech course in India and someone who does a tech course at an Ivy League school, the person in the developed country is probably more able to do this job simply better, and therefore therefore is more likely to be hired over the person in the developing nation. But even if you can get some workers to the extent that they would be competitive, wealth then is mainly concentrated in the cities. No, thank you. This is because this is where the universities are. This is where training centers are. Notably, because of poor roads, because people often lack money to own a car to be able to drive far away, they might have to work to support their families. These people who are rural, people who are poor, people who are struggling, are the ones who are specifically unable to ever access this training and ever get these jobs. And the impacts of this are simple. You cannot develop this industry, but even if you could, it wouldn't be competitive. But even if it was, the benefit is to such a small group of the population that it wouldn't matter. I'll take that POI.
Why can't we just import a lot of these shortages? And why can't we partner through joint venture to be able to build these manufacturing as opposed to having to do it ourselves? Because we agree it's expensive, that's what you said.
So the reason that we can't just import people to teach and ways to do this is because, firstly, it's an uncertain investment. So a lot of FDI is not going to be sure on whether or not they want to do this. But if the government is doing it, it's just so much money, as I've already discussed. It's an exceptional expense. Okay, why are traditional industries better? The first thing I want to establish is that it's not a full startup cost. You already have some infrastructure that exists. People have farms. They vaguely know what they're doing on those farms, which means it's less of a startup cost. The second thing to say is that you can scale this up incrementally. Your expenditure can be more gradual. You can start off with tractors, you can scale them up to more factory farms. The third thing to say is that there's a comparative advantage to developed countries because you have high populations and low wages, which means it's very easy to employ people in these industries, especially if they're unskilled. So you can target your large rural population. But fourthly, FDI is likely to build the factories because they know it's a high population and a low wage, which means you don't have to pay for it, so you get out of the cost of that. Thanks so much. Proud to oppose.
Thank you for that speech. We welcome DPM.
Cool. Am I audible and visible?
Yes, you are.
Thank you for that. So I'm Joseph. No preferred pronouns. POI via the chat box. I'll definitely take one for a really good quality debate. Starting my speech in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Mr. Speaker, ladies and gentlemen, last time I checked, developing nations like Bangladesh, like Thailand, like Vietnam, many parts of Asia, some parts of Africa, and in Latin America have a common denominator. They have really done well to be able to perfect the service industry, hence why a lot of Americans and Europeans outsource them as teachers, outsource them as engineers and coders, and outsource them for things like hospitality. The service industry is not nascent in these developing nations. It's something thriving to the point that a lot of these countries have millions of overseas foreign workers who work abroad and send remittances back home. They are valuable to the economy. What we believe, coming from side government, is that in order to gain a competitive advantage and preserve what you already have, you need to do what you're doing well, as opposed to dabbling in things like manufacturing, which are nascent in these developing nations. That is not to say we in parts of Asia do not have infrastructure, we do not have Wi-Fi, we do have those things, but even if in the world that they operate in, which we don't have those things, I don't think why we should have to build a manufacturing hub for routers or Wi-Fi capacity. We need to be able to outsource that if we really need it in order for us to be able to be functioning to continue exporting the best thing we do, which is human capacity and talent. There are 3 pushes I have from side government. Number 1, I am going to talk about the valuation of labor and how right now there is largely this whole misunderstanding. Oh, manufacturing, you're so much better. If you do service stuff, you're just a nurse, you're just a waiter. I'm going to shatter that worldview. Secondly, I'm going to talk about how economies of scale work in order to be able to develop nations to protect the competitive advantage they already have. And thirdly, I'm going to weigh the nature and opportunity cost of investment when you prioritize manufacturing, a harm that exists solely on side opposition. Before that, a couple of extraneous rebuttals. The first speaker gives this assertion of how it's not set up properly and it's going to be used poorly. I have a couple of responses. A, if you take a look at Bangladesh and India, they have perfected the service industry when you look at their BPOs or call centers, wherein you have companies like Meta, like Google, and all of the Magnificent Seven literally hiring them because they speak good English, they have a good work ethic. We don't see why India, for instance, or Bangladesh should somehow double down on creating something that they don't have, which is manufacturing. Something Hesaya told you, which is like manufacturing things like ships, like e-vehicles, and all other capacities. B, this push about agrarian industries. Ladies and gentlemen, if you're not aware, many developing nations in Africa or in Asia are actually along the Pacific Ring of Fire, which means you have many earthquakes, you have multiple tsunamis, hurricanes, and storms that plague us during half of the year. That is to say, that's the reason why we have to be able to import rice. As sad as that is, we simply are not geographically positioned to be able to do that manufacturing, even if they assert that labor is cheap. We tell you, yeah, labor is cheap, but raw materials, technology, IP, and capacity is not. Labor is cheap, which is precisely why we want to be able to continue exporting, because that's where our competitive advantage lies. A Filipino nurse or a Thai nurse not only is beautiful and kind, but they are also cheaper on a per unit economics basis. Sure, POI respond.
Yes, so developing the service industry doesn't mean making more nurses, it means developing the nursing industry. So it's like you make more call centers, that is developing a service industry. Just sending more people abroad isn't the development of an industry domestically. You are just sending people out. Those people will go out in our world as well. The government doesn't do anything there.
No, bro, you have to defend the burden of manufacturing. We're completely fine with supporting like building more hospitals and stuff that are service oriented, whether that be domestically or internationally. But we think we're willing to bite the burden and also say that we rather support the service industry when we export thousands of people all across the world who give back millions upon millions of pesos or dollars through remittances, something that Hesaya talked about in his speech that the previous speaker had ignored. Let's talk about the valuation of labor. Currently, right now, there's so much romanticization for things like manufacturing because it fucking sounds cool. Because you want to be able to do things like build a factory, build a supply chain. But how expensive is that? In fact, the comparative, wherein America and Europe already perfected it, given how Americans monopolize huge tech, hence why Mag 8 and Mag 7, the biggest countries in the world, are all fucking tech. You can't expect Asia to have to compete with that. That makes no sense. There is no upside. Which is why the valuation of labor, in terms of saying that you are not just a waiter, you are not just a nurse, you are an integral part of our society, is a point in which you can actually compete. B, how does economies of scale work? In order to get economies of scale for service, which we already have, contrary to popular belief, good can always get better. We reject this whole BS about working on your weaknesses, brah. Nah, we're leveraging our strengths to be able to compete more. Why? Because when America and Europe start looking at us as a threat, because now we're getting into industries they already have, is a point in which they're likely to crowd us out, put certain trade embargoes and blocks on us, not subscribe to us, or heck, even buy us out. We rather have what Hesaya mentioned, which remained unresponded to, which is being able to have this mutually beneficial relationship. You scratch mine, I scratch yours. Lastly, on this idea and nature of opportunity cost to prioritize manufacturing. On their side, even if you're able to do it, which is the best case of their side, you're likely to fall into Chinese debt traps given these things simply take so longer that you need to be able to fund them by taking in long-term debt with a high interest rate, especially where we are right now. And ultimately, it becomes dependent on their capacity to be able to pay. Ladies and gentlemen, it sounds cool, it sounds sexy, it's a terrible thing to implement. Even if we do, it puts these countries at a disproportionate amount of risk. We rather have a competitive advantage where it's working, where we can optimize it. We are very proud to stand on side governments.
Thank you very much for that speech. Welcome, DM.
Oh, just give me 2 seconds. POIs verbally, please. Sure. So my speech in 3, 2, 1. Opposition sides for giving your average person in a developing country a better quality of life. And this comes in two ways. The first way that we can do this is just giving each individual person more money by giving them opportunity to access employment that they can do and they can do in the long term, and that isn't subject to things like economic shocks or things like global crises or domestic crises that might make it very difficult for them to be employed, because that's what benefits your average person the most. But the second thing that we can do is we can give them in their own country certain goods that are readily used, readily available, and necessary, which are obviously things like food, which are obviously things like small manufactured goods and ETFs, which are things that people can use the most and will improve their quality of life the most. The problem with the Gov case is it benefits a couple of people a lot and the vast majority of people not a lot, because things like remittances are actually very misleading, because it's someone making money overseas and then sending it back home to maybe your family can use it for something, but not much else. Your average person in that country isn't getting much funding, but the problem with this is entirely symmetric. It happens on both sides. We're not stopping people going overseas. I'm very confused as to how this argument works differently on both sides. Two questions then to answer in this speech. The first of which is, how do we get more people employed? Because this is how you improve the quality of life the most for your average person. And the second of which is, how do we improve the wider developing nation? Just in general, how does your quality of life become better? The first thing to note here under how do we get people employed, we give you 4 claims. The first of which is that in the primary industries require much less setup. Secondly, that you get way more FDI because you have a capacity to grow the industry enormously. The third thing to prove here is that it just generally requires less education, noting that the vast majority of people in these countries are very limitedly educated, apart from the very small percentage of people that they say can be nurses and doctors in places like Singapore and the Philippines and go overseas. Obviously, that still exists under our side, but the vast majority of people have very limited amounts of education. And we proved to you in our Leader of the Opposition speech that it's incredibly large setup cost to get all people educated immediately. And the last thing that we say here is that these industries are incredibly well insulated economically. So when you have things like economic shocks, if you live in the Pacific Ring of Fire, if you have something like an earthquake, you don't cop very much damage if you own a crop farm. But if your entire building collapses because you're hosting a call center, then you host way more damage. All of these people are immediately unemployed, and you have no industry that's of use to everyone. So you're way better shielded of things like economic shocks. But additionally, with the actual real threat that exists in the modern world of things like diseases and viruses, these are the industries that can stay open because everyone needs food. So these are obviously far better industries. We have a few pushbacks from side opposition. The first of which is a strange one from the first speaker, which is just to say that Singapore is a primarily service-based industry, and you shouldn't tear that up because we've made such a good job in order to get that to the place that it is. The first thing to say is that a plain English reading of the motion is just a hypothetical nation, so it's not something like Singapore. It is just a developing nation that has all the characteristics that we characterize to you. Things like limited economy, things like limited education, things like limited employment, and those sorts of things that are associated with it. Anything else that you associate with it needs to be done under likelihood analysis rather than just asserted and associated with a particular country such as Thailand. But the second thing that we point out is that generally the biggest economies that are developing are generally agrarian and have primary industries as their dominating force. Places like India and Pakistan and a huge amount of Africa are the best examples of this. Statistically, you are most likely to be talking about one of these nations. But the third thing I would point out here is that your average, the third thing that I'll point out here is that even in countries where this isn't the case, it is mostly because the uber wealthy own the vast majority of the profits. So in call centers in India, your average person is earning incredibly little amount of money, but the owner of the call center, or generally a ring of call centers, is earning an enormous amount of money. This is a very misleading statistic because it says that India is earning a huge amount of money from the service industry, but it's actually one dude who's earning an enormous amount of money and everyone else who's earning essentially no money. Whereas under our world, you'd have far more money distributed far more equitably and far more equally because people are doing a far better job. People are doing far more important work, and that work is obviously valued because it is something like labor. But fifthly, I would point out that the call from Fifthly, in response, we would say we're obviously not tearing down the industries that exist here. Obviously, they are still going to continue to exist, but the vast majority of nations who are developing, which is what this topic and motion is obviously about, should just focus on these primary and developing. I'll try again. Should focus on these primary industries because they have the most capacity for growth for the 4 major reasons that we tell you, none of which receive any valid response. If there's a POI on any of that, I would like to take it. Seeing none, noting lack of engagement, moving on. So at the end of this, what you should note here is that both are relevant in a developing country, obviously, but for your average person, you should just focus on something like getting employed, to focus on something like improving your quality of life. The most proximate way that you can do it is by promoting the primary industry. Cool. The next thing to claim here and the next thing to focus, as they say, is something like remittances are extremely valuable and you can promote them very well. The problem with this is a number on a screen and it doesn't actually mean anything for your quality of life of the average person. It means a little bit for the family of the one guy who got lucky and got educated and went overseas. but for average person, it means very little. But secondly, I would note here that it's a great tragedy that they need to go overseas in order to get access. Oh, sorry, scratch that. The second thing to note here is this happens entirely symmetrically. We've already proven this. The last claim that they try to make, and this is a bit of a stab in the dark, they say you can't outcompete the US on something like economies of scale. I point this out in a POI to the first speaker, who seemed quite confused at it. So let me re-explain. But obviously, you don't need to export in order to get any benefit here, because if you're producing something like food, you can sell it to your people locally, and they get a huge amount of benefit from that, because there is a market for food everywhere all over the world. You don't need to outcompete. It's expensive to import, particularly when you have low labor, particularly when you have higher labor costs elsewhere overseas. But the second claim I would make here is that the biggest comparative advantage you have in the developing world is on labor. So when you are able to put people in pure labor positions, something like farming, something like manufacturing, you are able to get the most benefit, and you do have the most comparative advantage there. That was a very confusing claim from side proposition. Yeah, I think I did see a POI, so I'll happily take that now.
Yeah, so how are these nurses and teachers gonna be able to pivot? Because you have to make a trade-off on your side. Wherein if you focus too much on manufacturing, what are they gonna do? Build these things or have to switch industry?
Like, mate, you already have the same problem under your side because they go overseas. You don't have the industry there. But the problem is the vast majority of people aren't nurses. Just a lot of money gives to those very, very, very few amount of people. And a lot of money comes from remittances. But the vast majority of people are unemployed, have very limited education, and you can access that. But secondly, they can still do what you're claiming is a good thing under our side by going overseas and sending remittances back home. There's no reason as to why we're stopping that. We're not tearing down the service industry that currently exists. We're just prioritizing moving forward, building the primary industry. Very confusing question. The second claim that we would then make, or the second question that we have, is how does this prove your quality of life of the average person? We have two claims. The first of which is that food is the most important and protected thing, and it's the most approximate way that you can prove your average person's quality of life. And if we do that, that's great. The second thing is just service don't benefit the majority of people marginally. If you have a lot of nurses that are going overseas, your home country is not benefited at all. That's pretty problematic. Opposition's response are twofold. The first of which they would say is, well, why wouldn't you just import things like teachers if it's really hard to do so? The first claim that we would make in response to this is that it'd be quite expensive. The second claim that we would make is, well, they probably wouldn't want to come to a developing nation, whether you do not have much money to give them in order to value them for their services because cost of wages are quite low. The third thing we point out is that you still need other infrastructure, things like schools, in order to make that work, which is something that is not worth for these vast majority of these developing countries to do at this point in time. The second claim they make is about the Pacific Ring of Fire. Obviously, I've already responded to this. If you're in the Pacific Ring of Fire and you have a service industry like a call center, it all collapses and you'll immediately get unemployed. But if you have something like an agrarian industry, you don't die immediately when you're in the Pacific Ring of Fire, and that's a pretty good outcome, I would suggest. Better world, better economy for these developing nations, and the average person, which is the most important thing in this debate, gets the biggest benefit. Clearly vote opposition.
Thank you for that speech. We welcome, Gavwe.
Hi, hello. Am I audible?
Yes, you're audible and visible.
Thank you so much. Okay, I'll take a POI. Voice, say it once. I will definitely hear you. Okay. The timer. In your side. Thank you. Okay. I will begin in 3, 2, and 1. The intuition pump that we posit to you inside government is incredibly simple. We should target that which we already do well, and we should strategically pivot to things that we don't do that well. On opposition side, even if you are successful in establishing your factory or a manufacturing industry, at no point are you able to have a chance against the international markets. At no point will you create an economy of scale that rivals those particular countries. At no point will you actually rise out of the state of developing that you are currently in. Opposition seems to believe in a false characterization of how vulnerable the capacity of these developing countries actually operate under. Because yes, workers here are paid less. We do have a lot of them. But the cost of creating that system is literally going to curtail all of the money that DLO wants for the average person. Let me be clear, the less money you spend on the strengths you already have currently, that particularly leads to you losing that particular strength and allows avenues for other countries to actually subsume a lot of the current comparative advantage that you already have. Before I move on to the two clashes in this debate, a couple of responses to the previous speaker. One, they in their POI try to scroll the motion and say, we are going to build manufacturing for service industries. We think that we can co-opt that benefit when we have current joint ventures with the international corporations to actually build those particular things. We do not have to do it ourselves. That's the unique burden that opposition has to prove in their speech. Secondly, DLO underplays remittances and how they work. 80% of remittances come from the service industry because of a large amount of overseas workers who send dollars back home since they work abroad. We want to grow the service industry that actually creates a lot of these jobs to begin with, as opposed to opposition where they are outcome dependent on doing it well and succeeding. It's very important. You have so many successes that have to happen to unlock all of their benefits. On government, it's just a lower hanging fruit or a lower barrier to actually prove because we have already this particular economy of scale to compete. Therefore, it's probably within our interest as a developing country to push that competitive advantage more and not lose a lot of leverage, as to what Josef says in his speech, of which we heard no rebuttal. Thirdly, DLO talks about equity and ownership being important, meaning we rather have our own stake in manufacturing. However, as what we consistently characterized, a lot of these nurses, waiters, and people in service cannot make that particular pivot or switch to the manufacturing industry. Even if they did did it in their home country, the home country loses out on their own particular advantage because they try and chase multiple things at once, but they don't catch any of it. Op just cannot have their cake and eat it too. Lastly, the agrarian industry that we built on Op becomes a huge sunken cost if you spend money there, and it just gets wrecked by all of the elements or all of the external factors that exist in regards to you propping up that industry to begin with. What's the first clash? I think this debate nuances its importance on the likelihood of success on where can these developing states be better off. What then did my partner say? I think Hesaya gave a very important characterization in the round. The biggest comparative advantage in states like the Philippines, the Latin American countries, certain parts of Africa and India are literally human capital. Like, it's intuitively true that Pinoy nurses are a huge part of our economy for all of the remittances they give back. Even in LO's own examples, India has high human capital in the call centers that they themselves prop up. It's a lot of things that already do exist in status quo. Two, it's really not a parasitic relationship. It's actually quite symbiotic and
Meanwhile,
both countries to begin with. I think LO doesn't understand that these service industries have already been propped up and set up. This is a direct response to LO's first and second argument. One, we aren't that poor. I understand I'm a member of a developing world, but we also have emerging markets, or we're not as wrecked as what LO claims us to be. Secondly, I don't think that she necessarily characterizes their particular case in the real world. Hesaya quite clearly explained the reason why comparative advantage already exists and exists to a really, really big extent on our side. The reason why the US or Europe or developing states get Filipino nurses, they get Thai nurses, they get Indian tech support is precisely because we already have an advantage into this particular thing, and they are not likely to want to do these things because it's relatively low labor, or it's not that you don't need a lot of skill in order to do it. Josef explains on this particular point. So what happens then is the particular trade-off. Hesaya says you have just a lot more capacity in being able to understand and get the mutual benefits coming if you go to outward into all of these particular developed countries. That is to say, it's a shared benefit as a consequence of you being able to do this. The exclusivity I really want to emphasize is that you really don't have this capacity to a broader extent if you focus on another thing that is likely to actually not even occur to begin with, or even if it does, it loses a lot of capital for the particular country. I'll take the POI before the second clash. Go.
Just to clarify, because you're sending more people abroad for remittances, your model would look like, I don't know, more baby making factories, like you'll have more reproduction programs. It's unclear what burden you've taken to improve the service industry other than shipping people out, which you can just, I guess, make more children and then ship them out. There is no development in your world.
Yeah, so we enable more money to enter these particular service industries. Because there is now more money, there is more capital for these industries to be able to use it in order to bolster whatever it is that they do in these industries. I want to clarify that it's quite absurd that that DLO thinks that all of these service requirements need a high level of education. Just like vibe check that. Really quickly, I think the second clash then has to come in into how this international community reacts as a consequence of whatever it is we do, right? We either support or we actually build all of these new particular industries. I want to note that I don't really think that DLO has even responded to Joseph extension at this particular point. So that means a lot of his standing benefits needs to be responded to at least by opposition whip. That is to say, on account, if you do try to do this and you do it quite well, that in and of itself provides the incentive for a lot of these developed states to literally go into your particular market and be able to subsume a lot of the potential benefits that you have. That being said, in status quo currently, we have a proliferation of our like service industries. We do well there. We want to do even well there in the future. On their side of the house, if you commit to something new, you probably won't even get it.
Time.
For all of those reasons, propose.
Thank you very much for that speech. You're welcome. Good work.
Can I be heard?
Yes.
Oh, that's helpful. There's three main issues with this opposition's case. The first is relying your case on a singular example, which is nurses in Philippines. Sure, that might be an excellent example. However, that is not how the rest of the world works. Because secondly, what they do consistently throughout this debate is lying. Because one, India is agrarian. Just because there's a few call centers scattered around doesn't change the fact that it is primarily agrarian. If you claim that you're Filipino and hence that is your mechanism relying on empirical evidence, I can claim that I'm Indian and it's agrarian. I guess this is how debating works. We rely on just empirical evidence and not mechanisms. But secondly, another lie is that Bangladesh is just primarily manufacturing. The most amount of money that they earn is through the clothing industry, through the manufacturing industry. Again, a traditional secondary form of industry, not a service. Thirdly, they do not have an understanding of how the service industry works or what their burden is in this debate, because I just simply do not understand what they're trying to do. If your claim is that the way you develop the service industry is by sending more people abroad to get more remittances, we can also do that. Guess what it takes? $0 or zero amount of money to actually do that, because you are just sending your population abroad, who probably, by the way, if you want to become a nurse from the Philippines in the United States, you probably have to go and retrain in the United States. Medical qualifications are often not transferable within countries. We can literally do that. People who wanted to leave in our country, they can leave. All you need is a pin and start poking holes in condoms, because that is how you get more people that you can ship off. There is no service industry. What they had to defend was things like building of more call centers, of building of tech-based industry where you can have more software designers, more coding designers, more people who work in AI, which is an emerging tech industry, AI, which is an emerging industry for services, banking services to connect you to different parts of the world. this is what service industry looks like, and that is something that they lose this because they do not understand what the counterfactual actually is, something that we clarify in our characterization and keep on asking through POIs. A few questions then I have throughout this debate. Firstly, the biggest claim they have is that developing countries should export human resources and get them to send money back home because you have a comparative advantage in these sectors. Firstly, no developing countries don't have comparative advantages. Just because uniquely Philippines has more nurses doesn't change the fact that the rest of the world, 2/3 of Africa, is just agrarian, and that doesn't change that. If you can throw specific examples, we just have a more general examples. In fact, we mechanize it for you by explaining that these are less developed countries, which means they did not have the capital to set up schools everywhere. No, India doesn't have fucking so many nursing schools that they can ship nurses off to the US. That is something that just doesn't happen, only happens in the Philippines. So no, on the whole, developing countries do not have a comparative advantage in the service industry. You needed to prove that mechanistically. You did not. We proved to you mechanisms through fucking first speaker to explain that. The second thing is it's unclear, firstly, how much remittance you are getting. Often I would argue that people who go abroad are not sending that much money back home because those people have to pay a lot of money to live in the US. I am an international student in Sydney. When I'm going to start earning, I'm going to send barely fucking pennies to my parents because living in this foreign country for me is something that is very expensive. So they're often not sending enough money because they have expenses in the foreign country. Secondly, this is only accessible by the rich elite, people who had the money to go to med school to become a doctor and then fly abroad, buy the $3,000 plane tickets, and then settle down in an expensive city. This remittance is only accessible to the few rich elites who had the privilege to get the education. Thirdly, the cost of retraining is often high because you cannot just be a nurse in the Philippines and go and become a nurse in the US. You often have to go through years of training again, which again, this is expensive to do because education is more expensive in foreign countries and further locks out the people who can actually afford to do that, further limiting the impact of these people. Fourthly, I would say, what a fucking bad idea. You are losing rich, educated people to another country. You are losing your doctors and nurses who are very important for the building of your nation to keep people healthy to another fucking country that is already rich and had all of these services that were developed. That's a pathetic idea. But fifthly, it is symmetric. They say we force nurses to pivot. Nurses that wanted to leave and go to the US still live in our world. Just because we're making a new factory doesn't mean we're forcing those nurses to go into manufacturing. They are just exporting people. They are not developing industries domestically. They're not biting the bullet or taking the burden. Sixthly, political issues, things like anti-immigration sentiment that, oh, these Filipino nurses are taking away all of our jobs are the reason why people from developing countries often do not get work visas, often do not have the opportunity to work in these countries. These are the reasons why this is a terrible idea. Do not lose your fucking doctors who will not get a job because everyone in the developed country is racist. Yeah, POI.
So if you build a farm or a manufacturing center, do you expect these nurses and doctors who have lives there and send remittances back to like go there and work there or wait for it to complete it?
No.
What's gonna happen
Again,
to
you would listen to what I said just now. This pivot point is stupid. Which we're not gonna put a gun against a doctor's head and ask them to work on a farm. A doctor will still always have people to treat. If they did not and wanted to leave the country, they can. This is a prioritized debate. We aren't converting everyone into secondary. If you were a doctor, you will still be a doctor. People in the Philippines need doctors. People in developing countries need doctors. There is no pivot. You can still do whatever the fuck you want to do if you were a doctor. Thirdly, then, who gets now? What do we present to you? We just get more development. This idea that it's more expensive to set up a farm and set up a factory is a fucking lie. Because compare that to the cost of setting the service industry. When you don't have banking services that are stable, when you do not have amazing Wi-Fi and communication services, and you have to build that all up from scratch, in that case, you spend more money as opposed to there's no such thing as building a farm when farms fucking exist. Compare that. But in our world, you get foreign direct investment that pays for it, a mechanism that comes out at first speaker because a multinational corporation will be like, oh, I can manufacture my goods cheaply in India, which is why I'm going to build a road and build a factory and build electricity to get that fucking factory running in India. However, you don't get that when you have the service industry. No one is going to open like a training center for fucking waiters in India, but also you need to educate people first. And then to educate them, you need to open an institute. To institute, you need to open like offices. These are so many things that you need to build, which again, why would you fucking do that when you have people in the US who are already educated and you don't have to invest so much into them? But also, lastly, we just get better distribution of wealth. Industries are throughout the world, throughout the country. The rural people get access to money through the farming that we develop, as opposed to remittance that only high elites get in their world. We are the country, we are the world where you could have competed because
Time.
US fucking service based. You were never able to compete against big developed economies. You could compete against other
Time.
ones. You.
Thank you very much for that speech. Call upon Upward. Before that, please could we tone down a bit on the language since this is also being streamed? Yeah, Upward.
Great. Just checking that I can be heard.
Yes.
Okay. Starting my reply in 3, 2, 1. I'm going to answer 3 questions in this reply. Firstly, I'm just going to go through what these countries actually look like. The second thing I'm going to do is explain what is cheaper to develop. And the final thing I'm going to do is explain what is better for the average person, noting, of course, that that is what we care about most in this debate. A number going up without practical benefits for citizens on the ground, for the poorest people who might not otherwise be able to access food, to be able to get a job. Those are the benefits that we must weigh the most highly in this debate, as we have explained down the bench. Okay, first question. What do these countries look like? The opposition has one main thing to say here. They say these countries are unilaterally, across the board, service-based. They give you the Philippines as their sole example. They then say that things like weather and the Ring of Fire prevent you from being an agrarian society if you are in the developing world. The next thing they say is that there are things like remittances. Okay, what are the issues with this characterization? Firstly, empirically, this is not true. The Philippines may be one example of this, but it is not the majority. It is not even a small minority. It is almost unique in the situation it has. Most of these places are agrarian, empirically, but we mechanistically explain why this is likely to be true. Because if you lack money, if you lack capacity, if you don't have Wi-Fi or roads, if people can't get a basic education, the thing you are most likely to do is unskilled labor, which is what agrarian and manufacturing industries are. Thirdly, we tell you that remittances only benefit those who have the capacity to go overseas and get an education. So even if this is happening, the benefits are incredibly localized and accrue to a small amount of people. But fourthly, we tell you developing an industry does not prevent people from going into these service industries. Like, we're not putting a gun to someone's head and saying, you are a doctor now, but you must be a farmer. That is not what developing an industry looks like. Developing an industry looks like prioritizing money into it, not forcing everyone in your country to do that. Okay, what is cheaper to develop? The opposition has a sole push here. They explain that these industries already exist, so it's easy to do more. However, we tell you that the things that are preventing the growth of these industries are systemic. Lack of Wi-Fi, lack of roads, lack of education, which is hard to get to and expensive, lack of banking services, lack of widespread communication, especially internationally, are systemic problems that you would have to wholly fix at insane costs to be able to do this. They also don't tell you why they get FDI, because they say, we have current joint ventures, but this is not a mechanism. This is an assertion. However, we mechanistically explain why we get FDI in these situations for a couple of reasons. Firstly, this is an industry insulated from economic shock because everyone needs goods, but they can forego services when times get tough. So it's a more stable investment. Secondly, you have a competitive advantage because you have a high unskilled population and low wages. And thirdly, it's easier for FDI to invest because you need less skill to actually perform these things, so they don't have to put as much money in to get the benefits to their dollar. So our side is obviously cheaper, but what is better for the average person? Firstly, the jobs we provide go to the people who are most vulnerable, unskilled, rural. These are the people who need help the most. These are the people whose dollars you should care about the most. Secondly, these products are most accessible to people in these countries because if you upskill and export all of your workers, your citizens do not benefit from those skills. If all of your doctors in America are in America, what happens if someone needs a doctor in your country? This is not something that people can actually access and therefore not a good benefit. They say remittances put money in the economy, but remittances are susceptible to economic shock, are probably quite bad to do because you leave your family and your friends, you're poorly treated, and you're poor in your new country. But they're also localized to the richest and most privileged. So if everything else is a wash, think about the average person. Think about the vulnerable people. You must vote side opposition. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that speech. That reply.
Hi guys, am I audible and visible?
Yes, you are.
Thank you for that. I'll start in a self count of 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Mr. Speaker, ladies and gentlemen, if you think about the average person living in a rural developing country, there's a reason in terms of why they choose hospitality, which is part and parcel of the service industry, simply because it's a low barrier to enter and they can make a lot of money. Even if it means having to sacrifice your life and have to go abroad and live away and build a new life there, only to send money back to your family every month, is exactly what motivates our side of the house. Don't let side opposition lie and gaslight you in terms of saying that we limited this debate only to the Philippines. If you check your notes, a lot of what our examples did cut across other countries as well, like Bangladesh, Thailand, and Vietnam. It's just like calling us out and saying, oh, we only responded to your idea of Bangladesh. Let's not debate that way. A lot of the things that their side claims are largely assertions and jumpy logic because they spam a lot of impacts. But the long and short of it is, a lot of what they say is outcome dependent on doing this manufacturing well and succeeding with that regard. That's why in the DEP and WHIP speech, they gave you like 14 ideas in terms of how it can be done. And that simply ties back to our case that it's not a risk we're willing to do because there are so many uncertainties in having to do manufacturing. Why can their side not take this debate? Firstly, it's because a lot of their claims are largely under mechanized and the impacts were largely not tied back to. Yes, labor is cheap, agriculture is nascent, but they're blind to a lot of realities that we consistently told you throughout our side. A, the geographical location and reason as to why we don't have developed agriculture. Because of things like earthquakes and typhoons that plague us half the year, these are very reasons why we don't want to get involved in it. Sure, I agree with Deb that it would be beautiful to own stake in these production as opposed to having to import and all of those things. But the reality is that whether we have that manufacturing or not, it's susceptible to a lot of these elements and uncertainties, wherein we rather focus on our strengths and be able to outsource what we do well, which is service, when we go abroad and be able to find those opportunities. B is on the idea of the upside of remittances, which is really important. There's an upside in terms of remittances precisely because a lot of these people who work abroad and do service send a lot of that money back home, meaning that's where we unlock a lot of our benefits, which are just relatively easier since they've already been doing it. And very clearly, coming from our first speaker, we told you why we rather double down on what's working as opposed to trying and figure out something that is nascent and hasn't been done. The second thing idea is in terms of a lot of the harms they posit can just really be solved without having to invest in manufacturing. A, the idea and problem PM had about tech and lack of Wi-Fi. We can outsource that or have a joint venture with the Japanese or Koreans to be able to build that. We don't have to make that ourselves. B, this whole weird idea on farming and agrarian reform, we just simply import more, bro, because other countries have a surplus. That's how it works. It might not be the best. I'd love for us to be able to make our own rice and have control over it. But the reality of the situation is that, yes, labor is cheap, but IP or all of the money that they claim to have on their side just magically won't happen. Look at your notes when I talk to you about debt traps and how a lot of these have just high interest rates and long-term payback periods. The long and short of it, ladies and gentlemen, is in terms of burden fulfillment, in terms of what we're really talking about, and the harms of manufacturing as opposed to the upside you get from service. We told you we're already doing it well. We want to be able to grow that in order to protect the competitive advantage we have and not spread ourselves too thinly when we try and do things which are very risky and can lead to failure, harming the average person. We are very proud to take this debate.
Thank you very much for that speech. Thank everyone for the amazing debate. Panel